It has been 15 years since the MCU started and a lot has changed in that time, so I wanted to rewind and go back to where it all began and see what all has changed. How we went from this to this. That's right, today we're talking about the second highest grossing movie of 2008, Iron Man. Wait, did you really think Marvel was #1 out the gate? Absolutely not. The Dark Knight came out that year, and that's still arguably the best comic book movie ever made. Iron Man almost got beat out of the box office by Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and just as an aside, holy hell, it's been 15 years since the last Indiana Jones movie.
I want to be a good archaeologist. You gotta get out of the library!
So it's been 15 years since we got a new Indiana Jones, but we're also getting a new Transformers movie this year, and we're getting a new Writers Guild of America strike. Man, it really is just 2007 all over again. Also, please pay people a livable wage. I mean, come on now. Also, Harrison Ford is 80 years old and he's joining the MCU this year, which is insane because now he'll be forced to talk to death about Marvel lore.
Okay, so you can tell me anything you want as long as it's something you don't know.
Yeah.
Do you want to just make some up because they won't know? Yeah. Just make some up.
Okay.
Proving to the world that he would rather talk about anything other than Star Wars.
Long time, yeah.
Fantastic.
So I have a sharp.
Anyway, that's not important yet. What is important, it is the year 2008. What is important is it is the year 2008. That's too many ises. It was thou year of our Lord 2008. You were listening to Low by Flowrider featuring T-Pain on your brand new iPod Touch in the backseat of your parents' 2005 gold Chevy Impala, and you were on the way to the movies to see Marvel's newest B-list blockbuster starring that one guy from Zodiac, a movie your dad really likes, and it's directed by that guy who made Elf and Zathura. Just as an aside, do you guys remember Zathura? That movie we all thought as children was just some kind of ripoff of Jumanji? Well, you want some curse knowledge? Zathura is a book, originally, written by Chris Van Allsburg, who also wrote Jumanji. This man had a thing for torturing children with board games, and I really think someone should have looked into that. But that also makes Zathura technically the second movie in the Jumanji franchise, so suck on that, Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle. I don't really know where I was going with that. Probably something to do with The Rock taking over franchises. Whatever.
And I've got to say, in all honesty, it's the biggest piece of dog shit that I have ever heard. Everyone's laughing, by the way, but it's true because everybody's heard it too. Everyone heard it, right? They look at it all, everyone's like, yeah.
So you're on the way to see Iron Man and expectations are mid. But you don't know what that means because it's 2008, so expectations are meh. You sit down, and 2 hours, 6 minutes, and way too many previews later, your life is forever changed, partly because you just watched the full credits of a movie for the first time in your life. Let's get into it. So I distinctly remember going to see this movie with my dad as a kid, and I was the perfect age for this movie at 10 years old. Because while I liked Batman and I still hold the Nolan trilogy as some of the best movies ever made, watching those movies as a kid, they're pretty dark. And as a kid watching a superhero movie, you don't really want something that's going to be super dark. Being light, bright, and fun is where the MCU really lives and dies, for better or for worse.
Back.
What are you doing?
I'm distracting you, you big turd blossom.
Plus, unlike a lot of the average movie-going audience in 2008, me being the big nerd that I was and still am, I actually knew who Iron Man was to a point because I really liked the Ultimate Avengers movies, which had come out in 2006.
Sounding like Thor's hammer on Dr. Doom's titanium-infused faceplate.
Which I would love to talk about those movies at length at some point because I strongly believe they were very influential in the early development of the MCU, and they probably used those movies as a type of roadmap when developing the actual live-action incarnations of the Avengers. So I had a pretty solid idea of where they could go with the MCU, due in a large part to the fact that I had rented the Ultimate Avengers movies several times as a kid at Blockbuster because they were one of the movies that you could get for free when you rented something that was new. Which, saying that now in 2023, probably makes about as much sense as the MySpace reference in this movie.
I don't want to see this on your MySpace page. Please, no gang signs.
Speaking of, going in for my rewatch of this movie, I forgot that it does the classic movie trope of starting in the middle of something and then cutting to several hours before. A real, yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got in this situation, or as film nerds would call it, an in medias res, which literally means in the middle of things.
This is me. I think it's apparent I need to rethink my life a little bit. What's my problem? First of all, I'm a rat.
Which we would see over and over and over again in movies like Deadpool, Deadpool 2, Thor, Captain America. You're probably starting to see a pattern here with these Marvel movies and this like starting in the middle of things. I do really like this scene though, and no, it's not for the use of AC/DC, which man, that was pretty dated even in 2008, and they really hold on to the Tony only listens to AC/DC for a bit too long. Take this scene for example.
You miss me?
But why I like this scene is because we start the movie with a genuine interaction with Tony and the soldiers, and they're having just a bit of fun together, just a casual conversation. Everyone's having fun, everyone is likable in such a small amount of time, which I think is really needed in this movie to set up the panic and the wave of emotions of the soldiers being killed in front of Tony, and it makes you care for Tony and what actually happens to him in this scene, because you don't know that he's an insufferable prick at this point. If you start this movie chronologically, the audience might not have any sympathy for Tony based on the way he's treated everyone so far. I also love that in the next scene, when they're recording Tony's ransom video, in this moment the audience is literally told who the true villain of the movie is going to be, but we don't find this detail out until later in the film when Pepper translates that video. By this point in the movie, we already know Obadiah is the true villain of the movie, but it's a really fun detail to notice upon a rewatch.
The target you paid us to kill was the great Tony Stark. As you can see, Obadiah Stane, your deception and lies will cost you dearly.
Speaking of the villains, let's just discuss those plans for a minute. So Obadiah is tired of Tony's bullshit and he wants to retake control of Stark Industries, and he wants to be able to sell weapons under the table in the process. So he sends Tony to show off their latest and greatest weapon in the middle of the desert, and he pays some terrorists to blow up a convoy with Tony in it. But not Rhodey for some reason, because he took a different convoy back to the base, which is just not explained. Anyway, so the terrorists are like, oh crap, we have Tony Stark, we didn't know we were going to kill Tony Stark, so they make a video asking Obadiah for more money, and then I guess they just decide, well, we have all these weapons laying around that we already got from Obadiah, and we have Tony, so let's just have him make the weapon out of all this random stuff we have, which is a dumb plan for a couple of reasons. One, you can't just take a bunch of random weapons and turn them into a Jericho missile. That's just not how anything in the real world works at all. Two, why do they even think Tony knows how to build the Jericho missile? Granted, he is smart, and we know this as the audience, but his whole personality throughout the film is very laissez-faire. He's a playboy, and there really is little to no chance that he actually had a hand in making this weapon system at all. Thirdly, why would the man who is currently dying with shrapnel in his chest build you anything? And you give him live ammunition? He could just blow the whole place up. What is he gonna care? He's literally dying. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, when he agrees to build it, you don't have a single person supervise him. Yeah, they watch him over some cameras, like some CCTV cameras, and they even see him making a leg at one point, and they just never question it. Like, you couldn't have put one guy in there. We have a bunch of establishing shots of them just sitting around like campfires. They're not doing anything. They're obviously not busy. You couldn't have put one guy in the room with them? I also love that there are two fake out villains in this movie. You have the first terrorist that Tony meets at the beginning, who he later leaves in the desert to just, I guess, be kicked to death by those village people, because he yanks him through a wall, but then he just leaves him on the ground. Then we meet who we think is going to be the true villain of the movie, Raza. And he gives this weird history lesson and speech about wanting to be the next Genghis Khan. You remember that guy that Tony instantly turns into Scarface when he's escaping? Which, when Obadiah sees him at their meeting, he actively mocks him about that, and I think that's so funny.
Compliments of Tony Stark.
If you killed him when you were supposed to, you'd still have a face.
The meeting is weird, though, because I think it's really just meant to be Obadiah realizing that he doesn't need Raza anymore and kind of cleaning up loose ends, because he just has all of Raza's men killed with this weird private army that is never explained and we never see again. And then he just immobilizes Raza with maybe the biggest MacGuffin of the movie and maybe the entire MCU. Right, so Obadiah has a device where he puts these weird blue LED headphones in, and it just emits some kind of frequency that causes all the veins in one's face to become blue, and it's supposed to immobilize a person for what he says is 15 minutes. He explains it as a device that they designed for the government that they just didn't pick up from Stark Industries, which is all fine and whatever, but it's really weird because it doesn't really need to exist in this movie, like, at all. Like, he uses it twice. He uses it once on Raza and he uses it once on Tony for the same reason. It's so that he can immobilize them and then exposition, which is whatever, and I get movie has to movie, but you really could have just hit them with a brick and then tied them up. There was really no reason to have this weird device that you're gonna, like, immobilize them with. Like, I fully expected that device to play a much larger role in the final act of this movie. Like, maybe he would have had it built into the Ironmonger suit, but we just don't see it again. Speaking of, Obadiah has, like, a couple weird gadgets in this movie. Like, he also has that device that he uses to remove the arc reactor from Tony's chest. Like, it's specifically designed for that, and you can't convince me otherwise. Did the kid from the Christmas Story design that instead of working on a working arc reactor? Like, where did this come from? I like to think that they just have a drawer full of a bunch of weird gadgets that just nobody ever picked up. It's kind of like the Google Glass of Stark Industries. So I want to talk about Jon Favreau for a minute, as he is the director of this movie, and arguably he really sets the tone for the whole MCU going forward. Firstly, it's very funny to me that he plays Happy Hogan in this movie, even if he's only in it for really 2 scenes. That's right, he's only in this movie for 2 scenes, when Tony gets dropped off to leave for the desert, and when he returns home for the press conference. In my memory going into this, I thought he had a much larger role in this, but that's in later movies. He really is just pulling a Quentin Tarantino putting himself in his own movie. But what I noticed watching this was how influential Star Wars is on Jon Favreau. In this movie specifically, A New Hope comes to mind a lot, which makes sense because he's a huge fan of Star Wars, and he's even working on things like The Mandalorian now, which he also cameos in. I'm sure I'm not the first one to notice this, but here's some of the things I took away on my rewatch. Take the scene where Jensen is trying to buy Tony some time and he steals a gun and he starts running down that hallway and he's shooting it in the air and he's chasing the terrorist only to run into a larger group of them at the end of the hallway. That is literally a perfect mirror of the scene in A New Hope where Han Solo grabs a blaster and he starts chasing stormtroopers down the hallway. Then there's the scene of the terrorists looking for parts of Tony's Mark I armor in the desert, which perfectly mirrors the stormtroopers looking for the crashed escape pod.
Look, sir, droids.
You could even view Jensen as an Obi-Wan type character who's there to help mentor Tony into the type of person that he needs to be, and he's lost ultimately too soon at assisting in his escape. You could also argue that they just blow up a giant reactor at the end of the movie to defeat the bad guys, all of the Death Star. There's also a few other scenes which seem to pay homage or parody other franchises, such as when Tony is seducing and sleeping with the reporter early on in the film. When they fall in the bed, the music sting is very evocative of a James Bond movie. Or when he lands in the village of Gomera, something about the way he kills the terrorist feels very much like Indiana Jones shooting the swordsmen and raiders to me. Both when he shoots the terrorist and the tank later on, it's very calculated, but it also feels very haphazard because he's trying a lot of this for the first time. This scene in Gomera actually sets up my favorite scene in the movie, which is Tony and Rhodey's phone call. This scene is the ultimate test of Rhodey's loyalty to Tony, and it also shows how while Tony has never been a good friend, Tony still trusts Rhodey literally with his life in this scene. We also know that Tony is suspicious of everyone around him at this point because he thinks what happened to him is not an accident, and it's important that he knows he can trust Rhodey. But on the topic of Rhodey, let's talk about Terrence Howard in this movie because, well, if we don't talk about him now...
Next time, baby.
Oh man, that joke just never gets old, does it? Terrence Howard was the first person to sign on to this movie, which means he was the first person to be cast in the MCU, and the first person to be replaced, but certainly not the last. I think he's great in this movie, even if he doesn't have a ton to actually do. Other than the scene we just talked about, he doesn't really have anything to do to move the plot along. Sure, you could argue that he keeps the military from joining the fight at the end of the movie, but really, we just need a reason for Tony and Obadiah to fight uninterrupted. Really, he only exists in this film to be the first instance of them setting up a character for future films. But back to Terrence Howard specifically, he recently announced that he was retiring from acting for the second time, but with how much the MCU has grown over time and how much money Disney has, I think he could be persuaded to unretire and rejoin the MCU as a new-ish character. Do not get me wrong, Don Cheadle is the James Rhodes at this point in the MCU, and I don't think that should change. However, with certain allegations, shall we say, coming to light recently about a particular MCU actor, I could very well see a way for Terrence Howard to re-enter the MCU, completing his destiny by being recast after the first movie, only to then be the one to take over a role years later to become the greatest threat to the MCU to date. But that's just my opinion, and we'll have to wait to see where all of that goes together. Overall, on my rewatch, I had a great time. I think this movie holds up so well, even the CGI, which oftentimes looks better than some of the stuff we get today. Which, let me be clear, that's not because the CG has gotten worse, or because the people working on visual effects now are bad at their jobs. Rather, it's because almost every scene now requires some kind of visual effects, and many of these people are having to work long hours with little direction and not enough pay. You can look up just how crazy Disney treats some of these people. I could really get into it, but that's a rant for another day. But back to the movie. I think this movie gets so many things right about an origin film that they will try to replicate to varying levels of success going forward. Some things that I particularly like is that Tony is willing to let people know his secret identity. And while yes, he just tells everyone at the end of the movie, there's a large trope in superhero media to hide one's secret identity even from those closest to you, which ultimately usually leads to just more problems.
I am Iron Man.
I also think it's important that this is an origin story that most audiences have not seen before. At this point in time, even non-superhero fans can tell you the origin story of characters like Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man. That's not really a credit to this film in particular, but I think it's a lesson that they do take away, that not every detail of a person's backstory has to be explained all at once in their very first film outing. Something we will talk about more in upcoming movies. I think it is also important that it does not make the entire movie an origin story. It's split up well, with the first act being Tony becoming Iron Man, the second act using his powers and refining them in a way that feels logical and entertaining to watch without ever becoming drawn out or boring, and closing with a big action scene and ultimately using what he's learned to overcome the villain. Now, I will say that this movie starts a trend which still happens in some Marvel films today that I wish they could really move away from, that being that the villain, at least power-wise, is just a mirror of the hero. I get why it exists. It's because it's easier narratively and for the audience if they both have the same abilities. But ultimately, it makes for boring action most of the time. Now let's get into the important items at hand. We need to decide if you need to watch this movie to understand the MCU as a whole. We need to give it an overall ranking, and we need to give it a tier ranking. Let's start with if you need to watch Iron Man to understand the whole MCU. I'm going to label it as a must-watch. While I think you can get by without knowing the finer points of Tony becoming Iron Man, I think seeing him pre-superhero is important later on for many villains that pop up. Also, it's interesting to see how each version of his armor improves a weakness it had previously. I also think if you were to ask people where to begin the MCU, this is the film most people would recommend, and if you do not like this movie, well, you're probably going to not like much going forward. So we're going to put it in the must-watch category.
This is exactly why I work alone.
Now let's give it a ranking. This list will be constantly updated as we go forward, so keep that in mind. Obviously, because this is the first entry, it's going to go at number 1 for now. Nice and easy. Lastly, let's give it a tier ranking. I think this movie has the potential to be an S-tier rating, but the villain ultimately being just a ripoff of the hero docks it a few points for me. Also, it being the first film in this franchise, it's really hard to be perfect out the gate. So for me, Iron Man gets an A tier. A for AC/DC. That's going to do it for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed, and you'll come back next time where we'll be going over...
This drink, I like it.
I know, it's great, right?
Another!
Wow, that felt so good to finish. I've been working on this video for over a month now. Hopefully each video going forward won't take me that long. I would love some feedback in the comments on ways that I can improve this content for you. This video was not 100% what I wanted it to be, but like I said, you can't be perfect on your first try, and I'm really gonna try and improve as we go along, so hopefully by the time we get to Avengers, we'll really have this locked in into what we want it to be. Once again, thank you so much for watching and making it to the end of the video, and have a good one.